Hello everyone, this is Doreen Horschig and I'm here with the College of Science and the Middle East Initiative, partnering with the Kurdish Studies program. Spring 2018 marks the 30th year anniversary of the chemical attacks in Halabja in Iraqi Kurdistan, in which thousands of Kurdish civilians were killed. And more recently, chemical attacks in the Syrian city of Ghouta and Khan Shaykhun, and also recently in Douma on Monday, killed hundreds of civilians. And we will explore the validity of the chemical weapons taboo, US and international reaction to the usage in Iraq and Syria, and the ongoing attempts to control and dismantle them. I'm here with Dr. Lori Esposito-Murray. She's an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and prior to joining CFR, she held the Distinguished National Security Chair at the U.S. Naval Academy, sponsored by the class of 1960. She's also an adjunct professor at the University of Connecticut and President Emeritus of the World Affairs Councils of America. Dr. Murray was special advisor to the President on the Chemical Weapons Convention during the Clinton administration. She received her BA from Yale University and her PhD from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. We are very happy to have you. Welcome, Dr. Murray.
Oh, thank you, Doreen. I'm very pleased to be here.
So I will have a few general questions for you on WMDs and WMD taboos, and more specific question on the US response to these attacks. So my first question really would be, do you believe the category of weapons of mass destruction is justified? Do you believe chemical weapons should belong in this category as a special categorization?
Well, the world community has acknowledged, officially acknowledged in treaties, that weapons of mass destruction include chemical, biological, and nuclear. And the reason why it covers those three categories of weapon systems in terms of weapons of mass destruction is because those weapon systems, and this does include chemical, which has been questioned in the past as to whether it truly is a weapon of mass destruction, which is the origin of your question. The reason why it includes chemical is because all three of these weapon systems or weapons are indiscriminate in their use and have an impact in an area, extremely large areas, and can have impact on large areas of civilians who are not part of a military conflict. And so it's the indiscriminate use and the particularly horrendous type of pain, anguish, and death that they all warrant, including the chemical, which has put them in the category of weapons of mass destruction. This is recognized globally, is recognized at the UN and the Conference of Disarmament, and that is propelled by global public opinion to actually do something particularly focused on this category of weapons in order to protect global citizens from their use.
Thank you. And so people oftentimes speak of the nuclear weapons taboo. We all heard about it, and it emerged during the Cold War. But then also, more recently, we have this chemical weapons taboo. Do you believe that this is a concept that exists and is relevant to countries, or is it simply a wishful theory?
Oh, it's very relevant to countries. The taboo actually, in terms of the 20th century modern history, the taboo actually stems from the horrendous number of deaths and the use of chemical weapons so extensively in World War I. There were about 120,000 tons of chemical weapons used during World War I, 90,000 deaths, and large numbers of injuries that resulted from World War I's use of chemical weapons. This really horrified the global public opinion, and we saw the result of that being the 1925 Geneva Convention, both on chemical and biological weapons. That was focused on their use in warfare. It wasn't focused on their production, on their stockpiling, on their transfers. It was limited to their use in warfare. But nonetheless, it was a global norm that was set up in treaty form, in a protocol form. The U.S. became a party of that in 1975. It's actually after Halabja in 1988 that global opinion was mobilized once again. And the result of that has been the Chemical Weapons Convention, which came into force in 1997. There are 192 state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention. That is a global consensus. It is a complete ban. It eliminates chemical weapons. Its purpose is to eliminate chemical weapons from the face of the earth. And so what has happened since it has come into force? 70,000 tons of chemical weapons have been eliminated globally. Every country has eliminated what their declared stockpile has been. A large portion of that was the U.S. and Russia. During the Cold War, our two countries actually developed and produced thousands of tons of chemical weapons. The Russians, in terms of their declared stockpiles, and I'm focusing on declared stockpiles because that's what is focused on in terms of a country's declaration, which has worked with the organization that's implementing the treaty, the OPCW, to work out what is the actual stockpile. So you declare your stockpile and then they're eliminated. The Russians have eliminated their declared stockpile of 40,000 tons of chemical weapons. The U.S. had declared, I think, around 24,000 tons of chemical weapons, and will complete that elimination in a couple of years. And Syria, for example, when it came into the convention in 2015, actually, or 2013, actually between 2013 and 2015, eliminated about 1,300 tons of chemical weapons.
Wow.
And so the treaty has been tremendously successful in eliminating, as I said, 70,000 tons of chemical weapons worldwide, which was the declared stockpile worldwide. The challenge now is dealing with the challenges to that convention, which include what is happening in Syria today as a state party to the convention, and has been happening over the past couple of years since they joined the convention, as well as the Salisbury attack, where it has been confirmed by the OPCW, the organization that implements the Chemical Weapons Convention, that the Novichok agent had been used, that the British were right in their assessment, and there seems to be no plausible explanation other than Russia having done that attack, which is a state party to the convention, and challenging the viability of the convention and actually dealing with these challenges.
Yes, and you mentioned Syria earlier. So President Obama set a red line for Syria that if it used chemical weapons on civilians, the U.S. would take military action. However, after the 2013 attack, the U.S. instead agreed with Russia and Syria in negotiations on the destruction of the chemical weapons arsenal of Syria. Do you think this weakened U.S. credibility in the long run, since we have seen a continued usage of chemical weapons by the regime?
The answer is yes, but. And I'll explain that. Yes, it did. If a president of the United States draws a red line, it definitely affects U.S. credibility if that red line isn't followed through. And the implications and the ramifications of that red line being withdrawn during President Obama's term are actually even more widespread than just the situation in Syria itself. It affects U.S. credibility with its allies, as well as its foes around the world. And so, yes, that is very important, and yes, it affects U.S. credibility, and yes, that was a significant turn in U.S. policy and turn of events in terms of U.S. credibility. But having said that, the outcome was actually a good outcome. The outcome was that there was an agreement between the U.S. and Russia, and the solution to the problem was that Syria would join the Chemical Weapons Convention, and that it would declare its 1,300 tons of what became 1,300 tons of chemical weapons and have them eliminated within a very short period of time. That was a very good outcome. That's 1,300 tons of chemical weapons that Syria cannot use today. And having them in the convention is also extremely significant in terms of the global community's ability to deal with the crisis that is happening today. Prior to 2013, when Khan Shaykhun happened, there was no way to actually officially request, declare that investigations needed to happen. Syria was outside the convention constraints. There was no way to really mobilize, not as an effective way to mobilize global opinion as if they were in the treaty and violating the treaty, which is what we're seeing today. And so the mechanisms in terms of being able to investigate, to figure out whether chemical weapons had been used, and also to punish to use the Security Council and also the Conference of States Parties to respond to the Syrian use of chemical weapons as a state party is much more effective, as well as being able to mobilize the global community with the 192 members of the treaty regime in terms of responding to what's happening in Syria as a state party is much more effective than prior to when they were part of the treaty. So yes, it does affect U.S. credibility when a president declares a red line and then decides otherwise, but the outcome was actually a much more positive outcome in terms of being able to effectively deal with the chemical weapons in Syria and deal with the crisis that we're dealing with today in terms of they're using chemical weapons after the declared stockpile had been removed.
Yeah, and talking about this reaction from the US or the international community, what do you think the response should be? Should it be a military action or sanctions, or, as you said, maybe treaties or negotiations are the best way? Do you believe military actions would have a greater containment effect?
So I think the response has to be a fulsome one and it has to include many of those aspects. In terms of enforcing Syria's commitment to the Chemical Weapons Convention, first of all, and in terms of making sure that this global regime stays viable, the international community, the United States, has to lead. The international community needs to work together. The 190 some odd state parties really need to work together to maintain the viability of this convention, because the nonproliferation regime is actually being challenged, and it has, as I said, had significant success in terms of eliminating the global stockpiles of chemical weapons worldwide. So yes, the U.S. policy, but it needs to be fulsome. You know what we saw in the cruise missile attack, which was very well orchestrated last year. It was a single airfield. There was a warning to the Russians an hour before. The message was sent, the damage was contained, and a very effective single response to send a message, in fact, is being challenged. And I think that clearly signals that the leverage that the U.S. and the global community gained by the military action was never really utilized in terms of finding a diplomatic solution to Syria. And that really is the crux of the issue. You have to use that leverage to actually find a solution to the Syrian crisis. And there are two levels here. One is the military action to ensure that Assad does not use chemical weapons again, and that's a particular mission and focus and strategy. Or is it to use the leverage to actually find a solution to the crisis? I think it needs to be both. I think in the short term, our policy needs to be leveraging as much as we can using the UN, using the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, in terms of enforcing and sanctioning and criticizing and globally putting pressure on Syria and Russia for the actions that are taking place, the use of chemical weapons in Syria. But the leverage also needs to include trying to find, so that chemical weapons aren't used again, the leverage also needs to include trying to find a solution, a diplomatic solution to the end of this crisis, because a political solution is really the end game here to end the tragedy, the human tragedy that we are witnessing in Syria for the past 7 years.
Yes, and having seen these different military responses to the chemical weapons used in Syria, Obama going the way of negotiations and Trump with his military strike, do you think that Trump's military strike was in response to Obama's so-called weakness to respond with force? Or to put this in other words, was it more of a domestic political power play of President Trump rather than a concern for Syrian civilian lives?
Oh, I think it's really clear from what the president has said that what he was very concerned that walking away from a red line hurt U.S. credibility internationally, and so there was always the main focus of this is the international component. You know, obviously there's a political component to this in terms of the policies that he ran on as president versus the previous administration, and it's a Republican presidency versus a Democratic presidency. But I think in terms of the main motivation, the criticism actually, the criticism of President Obama's handling of the situation actually stems from a major concern that U.S. credibility was hurt and U.S. leadership on this very important issue was compromised. And I also think it's very clear that the president's response is very directly related to an emotional response to the horrendous photographs and video that's coming out of Syria in terms of these chemical weapons attacks, and that's also very clear both last year and this year in terms of his response.
Yes. In reference to the horrendous effects, speaking more generally, do you believe that the U.S. has a moral responsibility to protect civilians in the Middle East?
I definitely think the U.S. and the global community at large, as a whole, has a responsibility to protect civilians in the Middle East, to protect civilians in Syria. I also think, given the Chemical Weapons Convention, the fact that 192 states are parties to this convention, that it is absolutely extremely important. It is the foundation of why there even is a Chemical Weapons Convention, to protect citizens, to protect humanity from the horrendous effects of these weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. What would the prospects for a world order free of such orders be?
So what would happen if these norms and treaties collapsed?
Yeah.
That would be extremely significant, and which is why it is incumbent upon the U.S. and, as I said, the state parties, the U.S., its allies, the state parties to the convention. The global norms that we have been able to create since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even before, we have the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty from 1970, we have the Chemical Weapons Convention post the collapse of the Soviet Union, creating a world order and norms actually to set rules in terms of what is considered, what can happen on the battlefield, but even more importantly, set rules in terms of the effects that weapons of mass destruction can have on the civilian population. It is so critically important. This regime is under siege. It's under siege by Assad. It's under siege by President Putin in Russia, and it's under siege by Kim Jong-un in North Korea. We actually believe that it was Kim Jong-un who ordered the nerve gas assassination of his half-brother just in this past year. It is absolutely incumbent upon the world community to respond and to ensure that these regimes that are a critical and central component, these non-proliferation regimes of a world order, stay in place, or we will be heading towards chaos and destruction.
Right. If one of these weapons of mass destruction is used, so either biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons, do you think it is justified with responding or retaliating with either one of these weapons? For example, if a state actor continuously uses chemical weapons, would it be justified to respond with a nuclear weapons attack?
The United States has always maintained its deterrence policy since the dawn of the nuclear age, has always maintained the option, the nuanced option, that we reserve the right to respond to an attack with weapons of mass destruction, chemical or biological, that we reserve. If we are attacked or our allies are attacked, we reserve the right to respond with nuclear weapons. It hasn't been that explicit. It has been a nuanced window that has always remained open in terms of U.S. deterrence strategy, that nuclear weapons are a legitimate deterrent to a chemical weapon or a biological weapon attack on us or our allies, extensive attack, because we also say we will only use nuclear weapons if our vital interests have been challenged. And so this became part of the nuclear posture reviews. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Congress had legislated that administrations need to have a nuclear posture review looking at every 5 to 10 years in terms of what our nuclear posture is in this new post-Cold War era. And in fact, every administration, including the Clinton administration going forward, have maintained the opened window, the nuanced window that we would respond. We reserve the right to respond to a chemical or biological attack with nuclear weapons. And this has been an important part of our deterrence policy. It's really interesting to note that prior to the Persian Gulf War I, after Iraq had invaded Kuwait, that Secretary of State Jim Baker apparently sent the very clear message to Saddam Hussein that if he chose to use chemical weapons against the U.S. military, that the U.S. would respond by, I believe the terminology was blasting Iraq back to the Stone Age, with the implication that we would reserve the right to use nuclear weapons if chemical weapons were used against the U.S. military. And that is believed to have been a very important deterrent to the fact that Saddam Hussein did not use nuclear weapons, or did not use chemical weapons, did not use chemical weapons during the Persian Gulf War I. Deterrence is a funny business. You only know deterrence hasn't worked because you've been attacked, but it's very hard to estimate whether your deterrence is working because of your policies, or has your enemies or foes decided other reasons not to attack you. But in any case, it has been considered a significant part of our deterrence policy against chemical and biological nuclear weapons that nuance has always been held by the U.S.
If these actions don't carry consequences from the international community, will Syria continue to use these weapons? And what do you think, what long-term implications does this have? Will we see more refugees, more chaos?
Well, that's the challenge. The challenge is to get the message to both President Assad and President Putin, who has actually assisted Assad and Syria in their deniability. The challenge is getting the message to President Assad that he cannot use these weapons, that these weapons are banned. He should be eliminating them. He should not be using them. They are banned with the support of the global community, and he should not be using these weapons. And that's the major challenge facing us, I would say, today. And how do you get that message across? I think what we learned from the U.S. response, military response, was that we need to do more than just respond militarily, that is a piece of enforcement in terms of the convention. But the piece also needs to include taking advantage of that leverage and using diplomatic tools as well, and mobilizing the global community that already supports this global ban in terms of making sure that Assad gets the message that this is just not acceptable.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Murray.
Well, thank you.